When you think about a leader, what vision emerges? Do you think about the characteristics or traits of a leader, or do you think about specific actions that leaders have taken? Do you think about the positive outcomes you've experienced as a result of working under a great leader? Do you think about yourself and what you've done in your role as a leader? Most likely, whatever you're recalling could be a function of your philosophy of leadership. And while we're on the topic of philosophies of leadership and effective leaders, I will explain the two pictures that I've put on this slide. Herb Callagher is the gentleman on the left. He is the founder of Southwest Airlines, and he was at Southwest CEO for many years. He has a very healthy philosophy of leadership. He begins by saying that the business of business is people. His priorities were very much aligned with contemporary views of leadership. What he said was, "My employees come first. They are my first priority, and they are my primary focus." Because he says, if my employees are happy, and if Southwest Airlines takes care of my employees, they will take good care of my customers. And if my customers are happy, well, this brings great joy to my shareholders. It's quite a contrast to today's views of many leaders of corporations who view the interests of the shareholders as number one and the interests of their employees last. The woman on the right is Pat Summitt, and she is the former head coach of the Tennessee Volunteers Lady Vols basketball team. Up until last year, she was the winningest coach of all time in the NCAA basketball arena, and that includes men and women's basketball. She has another legacy beyond simply winning games. Under her leadership, 100% of her student athletes have graduated. And why is that? Because under Pat Summitt's leadership, she emphasized the student aspect of student athlete, and she was revered by her players and her fans. On the next slide, we're going to introduce a definition of leadership. Bernard Bass, who is one of the leading scholars in leadership, stated that there are as many definitions of leadership as there are people who have tried to define the concept. How do you define leadership? Many times students tell me one word comes to mind when they seek to define leadership, and that word that they use is initiative. And I've reflected on that and have realized that initiative may not be the best term, simply because we can take initiative on tasks that we do in isolation without ever influencing followers. So the key themes that keep emerging across many definitions of leadership are the fact that a leader provides influence or is able to influence a group of people, and the second theme is that that influence is usually around a task that people agree needs to be completed. So in Ugel's definition, there are several key pieces that we'll discuss. Influencing people to understand what needs to be done implies that the leader tells followers or informs followers about the purpose of their tasks, why they're doing what they're doing. The leader also may guide or direct followers in completion of the tasks and trains followers. Second, getting people to agree about what needs to be done suggests that a leader must find a way to make the task appealing to the followers. And this could be done through motivational strategies, through vision statements and value statements, and so forth. On the next slide, you're going to see how other people have defined leadership. These are contemporary leaders. And hopefully this will give you a better appreciation of Bass's comment regarding the challenge of finding a universal definition of leadership. I would like to share with you several perspectives of two key people in the leadership arena. The gentleman on the top right is Max Dupree. Max Dupree was the former CEO of Herman Miller Furniture. He's also written several popular books on leadership, and one I highly recommend is Leadership is an Art. But according to Max Dupree, he believes leadership boils down to three main responsibilities. The first is that a leader should define reality, which involves communicating the organization's purpose and also the follower's purpose. The last thing leaders should do is to say thank you. According to Dupree, leaders should be generous with their praise and should acknowledge the efforts of their employees, for without their employees, the company would not be doing as well. I mean, that is the actual talent of the organization. And in between, a leader should provide service to followers. The leader should be a servant. And when you think about one who serves, that means a leader should be providing for others. And what those provisions are everything from moral development, resources, clarity, etc. The woman on the bottom is Jean Lippman Blumen. She is an author, a scholar, and also the founder of the Connective Leadership Institute. She is a professor at the Drucker School of Management. In her view, leadership is about responsibility rather than privilege. One who serves rather than be served. People who feel entitled are less likely to be concerned about the needs of others. Another of Lippman Blumen's perspectives is the importance of integrity and character rather than what she refers to as the celebrity status or personal appeal via charisma. We all have images of leaders who had charisma, but at the end of the day, what did they really contribute to their followers, and how did they leave their organizations? You can see by these differing views that leadership is hard to define. The way people define leadership likely tells us more about what we value in leaders rather than what leadership actually is. I'm now going to give you a very brief overview of the main themes that you are going to be introduced to in this module. The first approach that we're going to be exploring is trait approach or leader characteristics. What are the characteristics of leaders that employees and followers deem to be effective traits? In the 40s and 50s, a behavioral approach emerged where we started focusing on the actions that leaders take. From the behavioral approach, we also look at various leadership styles that correspond with certain behaviors. The contingency approach in the 60s and 70s is an approach whereby leadership scholars realize that there is no one best style. There is no one best way to motivate people, to improve morale, to get increased performance, simply because there are such things such as individual differences in followers. Followers have different needs. They value different things. Also, situations change. Some organizations might be in a very stable environment, others in a very complex environment, and also the nature of the task. So when you think about a routine task versus a very complex or ambiguous task, you can probably guess that different leadership approaches are needed. You will also talk about the leader-follower diet approach, which emerged in the 70s, whereby the focus was on the relationships that leaders develop with each individual follower. And we look at, based on the quality of those relationships, there are definitely different outcomes associated with them. We'll also talk about leader charisma, and we will conclude the module by breaking the positive paradigm. So instead of looking at what causes leader effectiveness, we're going to examine what causes leaders to approach the toxic cliff. So we'll be talking about bullying, leader abuse, destructive leadership, the kinds of things we run into from time to time in our organizations. Okay, on the next slide, we'll begin our discussion of traits. The earliest studies of leader effectiveness focused on traits or characteristics that were perceived as effective. And the list that's on the slide here certainly is not exhaustive, but it does contain the traits that consistently appear in studies of leader effectiveness. Self-confidence, and not arrogance, is definitely a trait that is associated with effective leadership, although we probably can identify leaders who may not have exhibited a great deal of self-confidence. They might have been very humble, but they were certainly effective. Leaders who have energy and enthusiasm are more likely to influence followers to have enthusiasm about the organization's goals and endeavors. Emotional maturity or emotional intelligence is simply the ability of a leader to be aware of what triggers his or her emotions and manage those emotions depending on the situation, but it's also an ability or an intellect to understand how other people are feeling and managing those emotions as well. Stress tolerance goes along with emotional intelligence in terms of being able to remain poised and calm in the face of adversity. Locus of control are the attributions we make about events in our lives or about things that affect us. The internal locus of control simply means that if an individual has an internal locus of control, they believe that they control what happens to them, or they have some effect on the events in their lives. For example, if someone was asked, "Why did you score poorly on the exam?" a person with an internal locus of control would say, "Well, since I control this, it's probably because I didn't study long enough, or I did not study soon enough, or I didn't take good notes in class." If you were to ask someone who has an external locus of control why they didn't do well on the exam, it's most likely they would say, "Well, my prayers weren't answered, or I wasn't wearing my lucky socks." But in any event, they would not be accountable for the things that happen to them. So we can see that leaders who possess an internal locus of control believe that they can affect change and that they are accountable for the things that happen in their lives. Now, there's also research on skills associated with managerial effectiveness, and the three, technical, interpersonal, and conceptual, are covered in UCL. Last, I want to point you in the direction of Miner's research, because Miner has conducted research across decades with regards to correlates of managerial progress or managerial advancement. And according to Miner, the three correlates that predict when someone might move up into managerial positions is a person who has a desire for power, and I mean that form of power in the most positive sense, which is called socialized power. So people who have a desire to use power for the good of others rather than to further their own self-interest are more likely to advance into managerial positions. Individuals who like to compete with peers, and I mean a healthy competition, right, where they strive to do better and to compete with peers, are also correlates of managerial advancement. And last, a positive attitude toward authority figures. So a person who understands that, I want to be a leader, I want to advance, but I'm also good at taking instruction, are more likely to be seen as good candidates for managerial positions. But here are the limitations of trait theories. The biggest limitation in this whole approach to studying effective leaders is there is not one single trait, nor is there a combination of traits that guarantees that we will be effective if we possess those traits. So with that in mind, the field of leadership studies shifted from traits and started focusing on the actual behaviors or actions of leaders to determine effectiveness. A social psychologist by the name of Kurt Levin developed the interactionist perspective. The perspective states that behavior is a function of personality and the environment, meaning depending on our personality traits and the situation that we're in, those two factors interact and influence our behavior. So behavioral theories make a lot of sense in terms of understanding that there is an interaction between our traits and the situation that we're in or the environment that we're in, and these might influence how we act. So the earliest studies of behaviors attempted to characterize what leaders did that employees perceived to be effective. There were two streams of research going on at this time. We're going to talk about the Ohio State studies in this module. Fleischman and Harris were researchers, or they were professors at the Ohio State University. And what they did is they went out into organizations and asked employees to list as many behaviors of their leaders that they saw in the course of a day. Over 1,700 behaviors were identified. And in an analysis that categorized these behaviors, two dimensions or two themes emerged. The first, as you can see, is initiating structure behaviors, or IS. And those are behaviors that show that the leader is very concerned about the task and that the task gets completed. A second theme that emerged were consideration behaviors. And these are behaviors that show that the leader has the utmost concern about people and relations. It's a very relationship-oriented dimension. So some examples of behaviors that fell under initiating structure are behaviors such as planning work, scheduling employees, giving feedback to people regarding goal attainment, tracking progress, and providing resources. And certainly these behaviors are important. I guess it's a matter of degree in which they're exhibited, because there's certain leaders who are very high in their task focus, and there's leaders who might be a little lower in task focus. So think about that as a continuum from high to low. Now, with regard to consideration behaviors, some examples of these are leaders who greet employees or ask how employees feel, showing support for employees, being friendly and approachable, showing empathy for employees' workload. So when we think about leaders who are high on consideration behaviors, we probably have very good feelings about these leaders because we believe that they actually care about us. Well, what was interesting with Fleischman and Harris's study is they went further than just identifying and categorizing the behaviors. What they actually did next was they looked at the files, work group files and outcomes, and what they found was this. When leaders were high on initiating structure and low on consideration behaviors, in other words, when leaders were primarily focused on getting the work done, without regard to how employees felt or being lacking empathy, then what happened was in those work divisions we saw higher levels of turnover and skyrocketing absenteeism rates, and we also saw that employees were quick to file grievances and complaints. Conversely, when they went and looked at the work units where leaders were described as being very high in consideration and lower in initiating structure, what they found was high employee satisfaction and high commitment, and just the opposite. There was less turnover, less absenteeism, and very few employee grievances. So we can actually look at these results and figure out what we ought to be doing as leaders, right? Which is to exhibit consideration to a high degree and know when it's time to basically turn up the volume on initiating structure, or when we should, tone back some of those behaviors. You certainly wouldn't want to be high in task focus when you have a skilled team, right? But they're looking for autonomy and delegation. So leaders need to know when it's time to turn down the initiating structure behaviors. A good example of a leader who's high in consideration and low on initiating structure was Herb Kelleher of Southwest Airlines. His turnover rate was very low. People knew that he cared about them, and he made it very clear that employees are my number one priority. I care about them. I love my employees. As a matter of fact, Southwest Airlines stock ticker is LUV. So we can see that there are certain leaders out there who are exhibiting behaviors that are very much aligned with what Fleischman and Harris found, and are seeing the same results. If you recall on the last slide, I mentioned the interactionist perspective by Levin that states that personality and environment interact to influence behavior. Well, contingency theories are also very similar in intent. Contingency theories of leaders state that effective leadership depends on factors outside of the leader. For example, when a leader is determining what style he or she should adopt or what approach he should use, well, the first thing we might consider is what is the level of expertise and what is the level of motivation of our individual followers. That we would not treat followers the same or use the same style if followers differ in these levels of motivation and experience. Another contingency variable that is examined in contingency theories is the nature of the task. Is the task routine? Does it involve redundant activities? Is it a novel task, a task that people are not used to performing? Or is the task complex, where there are no specific guidelines or policies to guide completion? Next is, what are characteristics of the situation? Is the organization in a stable environment, or is the situation unstable where rapid change is necessary? So, according to contingency theories, a leader has a lot of thinking to do. There's a lot of things we have to consider to be effective. The first is, well, what kind of task are people working on, and who's working on it? And what is the level of experience or motivation in these individuals? Well, depending on the answer, you would adopt a particular style. And in the leadership course in the MBA program and in the UCL article, there are several theories that are very prescriptive, and they provide advice for certain behavioral approaches we ought to be using to motivate our employees to ensure effectiveness. In the mid-1970s, the field of leadership started to examine the various types of relationships that leaders have with each individual follower, as well as the quality of those relationships. The term dyad above refers to a one-on-one, person-to-person relationship. And in this case, we're talking about the leader relationship with each individual follower. The theory that was developed in this time period was called leader-member exchange. Now, according to LMX theory, or leader-member exchange, leaders form different and sometimes unequal relationships with each individual follower. And these are typically very subjective assessments of a follower's capabilities. So, for example, early in the relationship, the leader will have occasion to interact with each individual follower. Now, at some point, if the leader perceives that the follower is dependable or competent or likable or personally compatible with the leader, typically that follower will be assigned to the in-group or will have favored status with the leader. Followers in the in-group tend to receive more support from the leader. These are the kinds of relationships where, as an employee, you feel totally comfortable in going into your leader's office and chit-chatting with the leader 10 minutes before it's time to go home, and you feel like you might be on equal status with the leader. You also get challenging assignments, but you're also expected to protect the leader and buffer the leader from failure. After all, you're a member of the entourage. Now, in some cases, a leader will assess a follower, and for some reason, maybe the follower is not personally compatible with the leader. And it could be as simple as the leader being a Laker fan and you, as the follower, being a San Antonio Spurs fan. Well, in studies, simply being perceived as unlikable meant you would be relegated to the out-group, which is a relationship that is considered low quality, that's more transactional in nature rather than a relationship that's built on affection and support, mutual affection and support. So members in the out-group, they're simply expected to show up to work and comply with the formal requirements of their job. They're not as likely as the in-group to get support or have time or have the leader's ear, and they're also not likely to be to have their work showcased to the higher-ups in the organization. So as you can tell, this theory, although a lot of research has focused on the positive benefits of in-group status, and certainly there are many positive benefits associated with being in an in-group where you have challenging assignments, you're more likely to perform well because the leader is giving you time, giving you resources, and so forth. But if you happen to be in the out-group and you're a talented employee and you have been relegated to the out-group simply because the leader does not perceive you as likable or personally compatible with the leader, then the organization misses out, and the leader might be missing some talent simply because of a subjective assessment. So there's a lot of research on LMX, and we talk about this to a much greater depth in the leadership class. We're now going to turn our focus to another concept in leadership called leader charisma. If we think about what prompted this field of study, although it gained steam in the 1990s, we have to credit a German sociologist by the name of Max Weber, who defined charisma as a divinely inspired gift. So not many people have divinely inspired gifts, but these gifts occur during a social crisis. And what happens is when people are dissatisfied with the status quo and a leader emerges that presents a radical vision that really differs from what we expect and is able to articulate values and ideals in ways that resonate with us, then we tend to attribute charisma to that leader. Right? So during that time frame, we were trying to understand why Hitler was so effective in convincing the Germans to commit heinous acts on humanity. This is what prompted the study of charisma, and as I mentioned, most of the research has come in the 1990s. Every one of us could probably think of an individual that we felt was charismatic, but how do you define charisma? I mean, what are the characteristics that we look for in a charismatic leader? And why is it that one person's charismatic leader could be another person's run-of-the-mill, ordinary leader? I will use for an example my dissertation advisor, Jean Littman-Blumen, who told me one day, she came into class and she told the students, Kathy, she said, when I was in Washington, D.C., I went to a meeting and Bill Clinton walked in. And the minute Bill Clinton walked into the room, it was like all of the oxygen had left the building. And I asked her what she meant by that. And she says what happened was when Bill Clinton entered the room and started speaking, everyone, gasped. So there was this collective gasp, and as people breathed in, the oxygen left the room. Well, for some people, Bill Clinton might be perceived as very charismatic. For others, Bill Clinton, not so much. I guess it might depend what party you're in. But for me, the charismatic leader that most comes to mind, that epitomizes what we would call a very healthy charismatic leader, was Martin Luther King. And in the leadership class, we analyzed the I Have a Dream speech through the characteristics and the traits of charismatic leaders that will be discussed on the next slide. This slide presents the traits and behaviors of leaders who we tend to attribute charisma to. If you have a chance to listen to Martin Luther King Jr.'s famous I Have a Dream speech, it's likely that within 10 minutes in that speech you're going to see some examples of the bullets that are displayed here. First of all, charismatic leaders are very skilled at presenting a vision of the future that is drastically different than the status quo. It's typically a very positive vision of the future. And they grab our attention by using rhetoric that contains metaphors and analogies and symbolism. They are known to engage in self-sacrifice behaviors. They take risks. We certainly saw this with Martin Luther King Jr., who was advised that his life could be in danger if he marched to Selma, but he did so anyway. So they take risks. They also express confidence in their proposals, and in doing so, they allow us to have confidence in their proposals as well. They inspire us through emotional appeals, and what that means is they are very, very skilled at not only identifying the ideals and values that they feel are important for the time, but they have a way of getting us to internalize those values as well, because they find areas where there is dissatisfaction and disenfranchisement, and then they talk about ways to bring people back to the center. And that's very appealing when you happen to be a person who feels that you're on the outside peering in. They see opportunities that others fail to recognize. And when we think about things but we don't articulate them, but we know we're dissatisfied about them, and someone comes in and talks about a fix, right, a cure, and others have not mentioned this, we're more likely to attribute charisma to leaders who can do that. And they're very skilled at building identification with the group or the organization. In the case of Martin Luther King Jr.'s speech, he makes a point of identifying the white people who are in the audience listening to his speech. And he encouraged all of his black brothers and sisters to refrain from engaging in the hate toward whites, because he stated right in the speech that many of our white brothers and sisters, as evidenced by their presence here today, realized that their fate is intertwined with ours. So he was actually elevating people in the audience to think of themselves as having a higher purpose and to engage in more of a noble endeavor together and identify with one another. In the next slide, we're going to focus on some contemporary theories of leadership. So you're going to want to read the Dierendonck article on servant leadership before going over the next slide. We're now going to discuss contemporary views of leadership. The information in this slide is covered in the Dierendonck article on servant leadership. One of the criticisms of charismatic leadership is derived on the notion, or from the notion, of the dark side of charisma. Charismatic leaders who possess dysfunctional personality characteristics, such as a high need for power, or insatiable ambition, or high levels of narcissism and Machiavellianism, they tend to want followers who are blindly obedient. They're well aware of the hold that they have on people. Examples include Charles Manson and Jim Jones and David Koresh and other cult leaders that you could probably imagine yourselves. So these types of leaders, these dark charismatics, are examples of what happens when leaders understand the devotion, the levels of devotion their followers have toward them, and they exploit that in order to achieve their agendas or their objectives. James McGregor Burns acknowledged that charisma had a dark side. He wrote a book and presented us with this theory titled Transformational Leadership. As you can see by the bullets that characterize transformational leadership, there are similarities with charisma. Transformational leaders are charismatic in a sense. They're able to articulate ideals and moral values that resonate with followers, so they're very good at good orators. But the key difference between charisma and transformational leaders is that the values have a moral component, but more importantly, instead of preferring followers to be blindly obedient on the leader and dependent on the leader, transformational leaders actually intellectually stimulate their followers to become aware of problems and to become key agents of change in the solution. So those are the key differences between transformational leaders and charismatics. Not every charismatic was dark, as we realize. You might think about Martin Luther King Jr. today as a transformational leader because he did use his charisma to transform society, and he did motivate followers to recognize and become problem solvers themselves. Now, the second contemporary theory presented in the article is this idea of leader as a servant. So Greenleaf is credited with the book Servant Leadership, and others have written about servant leadership as well. The traits that have been identified in this form of leadership, as you look at these traits, it's hard to imagine anyone who wouldn't want to work for a leader who possessed humility, who was able to empathize, and was a good listener, and understood when when the organization needed healing. We look at scandals today in organizations and realize that the number one trait that's emerging in leadership studies today is important to effectiveness is this notion of a leader having integrity and authenticity and being transparent. In servant leadership, Greenleaf talks about leaders as secondary to followers, that in servant leadership, leaders go beyond their self-interest. Their primary focus is service to others, and instead of self-interest, these servant leaders are also engaging in good stewardship. They're good stewards of the organizational finances. They're good stewards of their followers, and they're good stewards of their customers. And so when you look at this moral aspect of leadership, you can see why the contemporary theories have switched in focus from what a leader should do, focusing solely on a leader, to how a leader should think about the people he or she leads and how that person or that leader can enable their growth instead of the leader's growth. One of the advantages of being in an MBA program is you're able to take courses with faculty who have specialized in various streams of research. My area of specialization is leadership, and that includes ethical leadership and toxic leadership. In the graduate leadership course, we explore toxic leadership in much depth, and I often take my students to the Museum of Tolerance in Los Angeles, whereby we learn about the devastating consequences of destructive leaders. We also learn about the followers who aid and abet these leaders. But let's define leader toxicity. There are several definitions of toxic leadership, as you can no doubt tell by reading the Lit Review and the Pelletier article on leader toxicity. But defined, it is a process by which leaders who, by dint of their really dysfunctional personality traits such as narcissism and Machiavellianism and amorality, greed, hubris, what they do is those personality traits influence these destructive behaviors. And the end result is they inflict serious and long-lasting harm on their constituents. And the metric of a toxic leader is the extent to which how the followers are doing as a function of having been exposed to that leader. So toxic leaders leave followers worse off than when they found them. In the next slides, I'm going to cover what the results were from my study, as well as the effects that toxic leaders have on followers. Now that you've read my article, I'm wondering if you have the same appreciation for the challenges in defining toxic leadership as we do with defining leadership in general. There are certainly many researchers who are starting to devote some rigor to this important topic. What I did in my study is I surveyed actual employees, and I wanted to know if they had had an experience with a leader who they felt was toxic, or if they had witnessed a leader acting in a toxic manner to one of their coworkers. And if they did, I asked them to state what the leader said or did that they perceived to be harmful. On this slide, you see the themes that emerged from their comments. The first theme that appeared, and was the most commonly referenced theme, was leaders who attack employees' self-esteem. And they do this through public ridicule, demeaning their employees, and even marginalizing employees. The notion of social exclusion simply means that leaders fail to acknowledge people. They might invite only a select few to go to lunch. They might exclude people from meetings that are in their areas of expertise. And all of us could probably imagine a time where we saw the entourage return to work on a Monday talking about what a great time they had on the golf course with the leader or at the leader's party that weekend. Promoting divisiveness is another theme that emerged in the experiences of the respondents. Leaders who pit people against each other, who create an us versus them mentality, create a culture of divisiveness. So we have to be careful when we think about the environments we create in our organizations, because we certainly don't want to devise competitions in the workplace thinking that this will lead to better performance, because some types of competitions serve to promote divisiveness, because in some cases to win the other must lose. So there's a lot of things to consider with regard to that theme. Anyone who is a minority or a woman in the workplace certainly have experience with leaders who discriminate. And the harm that discrimination inflicts primarily involves feelings of low self-worth, or individuals feeling that they don't have any value simply because they're being treated inequitably. There are other leaders who, according to the respondents, engage in intimidation tactics, and in doing so, they threaten people's physical safety But in addition, they also threaten them psychologically. Let's talk about physical safety first. As you no doubt read in the article, there are some leaders who, when employees are prescribed bed rest, leaders actually have them engaging out in activities outdoors in cold weather. Another woman felt that because of the stress inflicted upon her by her leader, that she had a miscarriage, and she attributed that miscarriage to the situation. Leaders who threaten psychological security are very skilled in dangling the threat of termination in front of employees. So they remind employees that their livelihoods are guaranteed if they comply with the leader, or they remind employees that I can make your life very difficult. When you think about all of these themes that emerge in the experiences of workers, we can see why it's important to talk about this topic and devote the same kind of rigor to studying these leaders so we can figure out what we can do to prevent them from entering the organization. And if we can't do that, what can we do to ensure that the environment has checks and balances to keep our eyes on these leaders? In the next slide, we're going to talk about the effects that these leaders have on followers, which was a follow-up study to the article you read. This slide contains my most recent research on leader toxicity. In addition to asking respondents about their toxic leaders, I also asked them to tell me what effect their leaders had on them. On the left-hand column, you can see the themes that emerged when I analyzed all of their statements. And these effects are not surprising considering what leaders do and say to people. So if we are attacking self-esteem, you can imagine that people would feel a lower sense of self-worth. If we are threatening people, if we are being divisive, if we are excluding people, you could see that over time people might want to withdraw. So as you go down the list, many of these toxic effects are not surprising. On the right-hand side, we see the comments, the actual testimonies of employees who responded. The last row in this table talks about the self-conscious emotions of employees. Over time, when we work for destructive leaders, we start to exhibit emotions or have emotions that are very negative in terms of our health and our stress levels. Self-conscious emotions that are negative include anger, shame, fear. And over time, if these are the emotions that we are feeling in the workplace, we realize that it is going to affect our performance and our sense of well-being. So you can see the importance of examining not only toxic traits and behaviors, but also the effects destructive leaders have on their constituents. By identifying and giving form to these effects, it enables us to implement interventions in the workplace to assist employees with coping. More importantly, in my view, we should be determining how to select leaders who have a moral view about the responsibilities of leadership to prevent toxic individuals from entering or moving up in the company. As I mentioned earlier, we do discuss toxic leadership in Management 65, so I look forward to hearing your ideas for preventing leader toxicity in the workplace. Congratulations are in order because you have just completed the module on leadership. I really hope you enjoyed learning about all of the theories, and there were a lot of them, weren't there? And I do hope you now have a greater appreciation for the complexity of leadership and understand why it's so difficult to define the term. Before you go take the assessment, I want to leave you with a few final thoughts. I've been in leadership roles for 26 years, and I've studied leadership not as long as, not for the same period of time, but it's getting there. And I want to leave you with a few things to think about. As a leader, please make sure that followers know that they are your priority. If they are not your priority, reconsider whether you really should be in a leadership role. Your constituents are the talent of the organization. They are the people who make you look good as a leader. And all of the research is very clear on this one thing, that followers prefer leaders who care about them, who want to ensure their well-being. Next, make sure that you review the traits of servant leaders and reflect on your own leadership traits. Are you humble? Do you engage in stewardship? Do you have integrity? Because these traits are associated consistently with leader effectiveness and employee satisfaction. And our last thought for the day is to go back and review transformational leadership. This theory is becoming very, very widespread, and there's been a lot of research on it. And the outcomes associated with transformational leadership are mainly positive. I have yet to find a study where leaders who were transformational were not effective. So I wish you good luck on the assessment. As I said, there are only 15 items, multiple choice. So you may want to have your articles with you, do a quick review of the slides, and do a good job. Best of luck to you. I hope to see you in the program.